For over 70 years, Iran has been America's most reliable boogeyman, the regime that takes hostages, funds proxies, and builds centrifuges just to watch Washington flinch. What the headlines rarely mention is that the United States and Iran were, for decades, something closer to partners, bound by oil money, Cold War anxiety, and a shared talent for looking the other way. The relationship didn't collapse because Iran changed its mind. It collapsed because America spent 20 years making choices inside Iran's borders that Iranians were never supposed to find out about. So how does the world's most powerful democracy accidentally build its own greatest enemy? On New Year's Eve, 1977, Jimmy Carter raised a champagne flute in Tehran and called Iran an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. The Shah smiled. The chandeliers glittered. The wine was excellent. 26 months later, Iranian students were feeding classified CIA documents into shredding machines inside that same country's American embassy, and when the shredders jammed, they burned the files by hand. The smell of scorched paper and melting plastic hung over the compound on November 4th, 1979, while 52 American diplomats were taken hostage and the world watched a friendship dissolve into something that has never quite healed. Here is the thing about that photograph from the state dinner. Carter looks relaxed. The Shah looks pleased. They look like two men who have absolutely no idea what is coming, which, to be fair, they didn't. Nobody handed them a program for the next 2 years. Nobody said, "Enjoy the lamb, gentlemen." The revolution is on page 3. That is actually the most interesting part of this story. Because when people think about Iran and America today, they tend to imagine the enmity as ancient, as geological, as something baked into the bedrock of two civilizations destined to misunderstand each other. That version of history is tidier. It is also wrong. The hostility between Tehran and Washington was not inherited. It was built. Brick by brick, decision by decision, across roughly 26 years of interventions, miscalculations, and a breathtaking series of moments where both sides chose the option that felt safe and created something catastrophic. The Iranians did not wake up one morning hating America for abstract reasons. The Americans did not stumble into the Middle East innocent of consequence. There was a sequence, and the sequence matters. What does it actually take to transform your closest regional ally into your greatest regional enemy? Not a rival, not a competitor, but the country whose crowds burn your flag with genuine feeling, whose government chants your nation's death as policy, whose influence shapes conflicts from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq? It turns out, a surprising amount of effort from everyone involved. You have to overthrow a government here, install a dictator there, sell weapons to both sides of a war, and occasionally forget that the people living inside a country have opinions about all of this. Don't worry. We'll get to each of those steps in order. But start with the photograph. Start with Carter and the Shah and the champagne and that phrase, "island of stability," which must be one of the most expensive sentences in American foreign policy history. Start with how confident everyone looked, how settled the relationship seemed, how permanent. Because the story of how Iran became America's greatest enemy doesn't begin with anger. It begins almost tenderly with friendship. And the friendship begins not in 1977 over dinner, but roughly a quarter century earlier in a garden in Tehran, where a democratically elected prime minister was about to have a very bad summer. In 1951, Tehran smelled like rosewater and exhaust fumes and bread baking in clay ovens all at once. The city was modernizing at a pace that felt thrilling and slightly precarious, like a man walking very fast on icy cobblestones. New boulevards cut through old neighborhoods. Women in headscarves walked past women in Western dresses. Radio sets hummed in tea houses where men had been arguing about politics for centuries, and now, finally, They had a lot to argue about. Iran in that moment was something the West rarely acknowledged and rarely wanted to, a functioning democracy. Not a perfect one, but a genuine one. The Majlis, Iran's parliament, had been operating since 1906, born out of a constitutional revolution that most European textbooks somehow forgot to mention. It had survived coups, famines, 2 world wars, and repeated attempts by various shahs to simply ignore it. By the early 1950s, it was a real institution with real power, and real Iranians had real feelings about how their country should be run. The man they felt most strongly about was Mohammad Mossadegh. He was 69 years old when he became prime minister, famously emotional, famously theatrical, known to weep during parliamentary speeches and conduct diplomatic meetings from his bed in pajamas. The Western press found this eccentric. The Iranian public found it honest. Here was a man who actually seemed to feel the weight of what he was saying. In an era of polished political performance, his messiness read as authenticity. What Mossadegh was saying, consistently and loudly, was this: the oil belongs to Iran. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had been extracting Persian petroleum since 1908 under terms that were, to put it politely, colonial. Britain received the overwhelming share of profits. Iran received somewhere around 16 cents of every dollar generated by its own ground. The company maintained its own infrastructure, its own housing, its own swimming pools, none of which Iranians were allowed to use. The refinery at Abadan was the largest in the world, processing Iranian crude into British wealth, sitting on Iranian soil, surrounded by Iranian workers who were paid Iranian wages that did not reflect the scale of what they were producing. Imagine working in a bakery, producing thousands of loaves a day, and being handed one slice. Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in May of 1951. The vote in the Majlis was unanimous. The crowds in Tehran that followed were enormous and genuinely jubilant, people flooding into the streets with the specific energy of a population that has just watched their government do something they actually wanted. It felt to many Iranians like the moment their constitutional democracy proved it worked. In London, it felt rather different. The British government characterized it as theft. The American government characterized it as concerning. And somewhere in the background, very quietly, the word communism began to appear in memos that had nothing to do with communism, attached to a man who was, in fact, a nationalist Democrat with a flair for the dramatic and a reasonable position about petroleum ownership. That word, attached to that man, would do an enormous amount of damage in a very short time. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. arrived in Tehran in the summer of 1953 carrying false papers and a very large amount of cash, specifically around $1 million in agency funds, stuffed into a variety of inconspicuous containers. He was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, which is either charming or deeply on brand depending on your feelings about American interventionism. He was 37 years old, fluent in the regional dynamics of the Middle East, and operating under the comfortable assumption that he knew better than the Iranians what Iran needed. The plan was called Operation Ajax by the Americans and Operation Boot by the British, which sounds less like a geopolitical conspiracy and more like two neighbors who can't agree on what to name the dog. The British had been pushing for this for 2 years. Churchill, back in power and absolutely furious about the oil nationalization, had gone to Washington with a straightforward pitch. Mossadegh is soft on communism. The Soviets are circling, and if Iran goes red, the whole region follows. Whether Churchill believed this is debatable. Whether it was true is also debatable. Mossadegh had, in fact, opposed communist factions in his own coalition. But Eisenhower, new to the presidency and deeply committed to the Cold War calculus that saw a Soviet hand behind every inconvenient democratically elected leader, found the argument persuasive. The fear was that if Mossadegh's nationalist movement weakened the Iranian state enough, the Tudeh Party, Iran's communist faction, might fill the vacuum. It was a reasonable fear wrapped around a deeply unreasonable response. The mechanics of what followed were almost mundane in their ugliness. Roosevelt directed networks of Iranian agents, paid crowds, and military contacts from a basement in Tehran. Newspapers were bribed to print anti-Mossadegh stories. Clerics were paid to issue condemnations. Gangs of hired men, some of them actual street criminals pulled from Tehran's rougher neighborhoods, were paid to pose as Mossadegh supporters while causing violence, the idea being to make his government look dangerous and unstable. The smell of burning in the streets that August was not metaphorical. Offices were attacked. Printing presses destroyed. The first attempt on the night of August 15th failed. The Shah had signed the decree dismissing Mossadegh, but the plan leaked. The colonel carrying the order was arrested, and Mohammad Reza Shah, never a man of extraordinary nerve, promptly fled the country to Rome. He had been on the throne and he left it in roughly 48 hours. The coup appeared to be over. Don't worry, it wasn't. 4 days later, on August 19th, the second wave hit. More paid crowds, now explicitly anti-Mossadegh, poured into the streets. Military units loyal to the Shah moved on key government buildings. The fighting was real and the casualties were real. Somewhere between 200 and 300 people dead in a single day, though the exact number was never cleanly established and the people doing the counting had reasons to be imprecise. By afternoon, Mossadegh's residence had been stormed. The elected Prime Minister of Iran was arrested, still in the building he had refused to abandon. The Shah returned from Rome 3 days later, tanned and visibly relieved, and was greeted as a returning hero by crowds that had partially been organized to greet him as a returning hero. The distinction mattered, even if nobody in Washington was particularly interested in it. Mossadegh was tried for treason. He defended himself brilliantly, argued with his judges, wept openly, and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by house arrest in his village of Ahmadabad, where he would remain until his death in 1967. The democratic momentum that had built in Iran since the constitutional revolution of 1906, that had survived 2 world wars and multiple crises, was effectively finished. The Shah's government consolidated power. Political parties were suppressed. A new secret police force, trained in part by the CIA, was established. Its name was Savak, and Iranians would come to know it very well. What happened in those 4 days in August planted something in Iranian political memory that would take 26 years to fully flower, but when it finally did, it would rear. By 1963, Mohammad Reza Shah had decided that Iran needed saving, and he was just the man to do it. The program he announced that January was called the White Revolution, a name carefully chosen to suggest progress without suggesting anything so dangerous as popular participation. Land reform, women's suffrage, literacy corps, profit sharing for industrial workers. On paper, it looked like a nation striding confidently into the 20th century. In practice, it looked like a king modernizing his country on his own terms, at his own pace, with his own secret police standing by to clarify the terms if anyone had questions. And people did have questions. The clergy resented the land reforms that broke up religious endowments. The bazaar merchants, Iran's traditional commercial backbone, watched Western imports and foreign businesses undercut them while the Shah's court grew visibly, almost theatrically, wealthy. Students wanted the freedoms that came alongside modernization, not just the infrastructure. A young cleric in Qom named Ruhollah Khomeini said, loudly and repeatedly, that the whole enterprise was a corruption of Iranian and Islamic values. In June of 1963, he was arrested. 2 days of serious street protests followed in Tehran and other cities. The government's response was direct. Estimates of those killed range from dozens to several hundred, a familiar imprecision that tends to appear when governments are doing the counting. Khomeini was eventually expelled from the country. He would spend the next 14 years in exile in Najaf, then briefly in Paris, giving lectures and issuing statements, the kind of thing that seems manageable until suddenly it isn't. Savak, meanwhile, had been very busy. Established in 1957 with training assistance from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, it functioned less like a security service and more like a sustained argument against dissent. Its methods included surveillance on a comprehensive scale, infiltration of universities, political organizations, and even mosque networks, and interrogation techniques that Amnesty International would later describe in reports that made for genuinely difficult reading. The number of political prisoners in Iran during the 1970s ran into the tens of thousands by some estimates. The smell of the Shah's modernization had a particular underside that the gleaming highways and new universities were meant to obscure. Nixon and Kissinger, for their part, had decided that Iran was one of two pillars holding up American interests in the Persian Gulf, the other being Saudi Arabia. The Twin Pillars policy, articulated after British withdrawal from the region in 1971, essentially invited the Shah to purchase whatever weapons he wanted. And he wanted a great deal. Between 1972 and 1976, Iran bought approximately $20 billion worth of American arms, making it one of the largest customers the American defense industry had ever had. The Shah envisioned Iran as a regional superpower. Washington saw a reliable, oil-rich, anti-Soviet partner. Both parties found this arrangement very satisfying. The Iranians living under Savak found it somewhat less satisfying, but their feelings were not a significant variable in the Nixon administration's calculations. The pressure inside the country kept building, as pressure tends to do when you seal all the exits. What happens when a pressure cooker has no release valve is not, historically speaking, a mystery. And the man living in exile in Najaf was paying very close attention. In 1978, the most dangerous political weapon in Iran cost about $3 and fit in a coat pocket. Ruhollah Khomeini had been living in the Iraqi city of Najaf for over a decade, but exile had not diminished him. If anything, distance had clarified his image into something cleaner, more mythological. He was not merely a cleric anymore. He was a symbol with a beard and an unflinching stare, and starting in the early 1970s, his voice was being smuggled across the Iranian border inside cassette tapes. Ordinary tapes. The kind you might record a favorite song onto. Played in homes, in mosques, in the back rooms of bazaars, his sermons moved through Iran's existing religious networks like water through already laid pipes. The Shah's security apparatus had spent years infiltrating universities and political parties, and had largely succeeded. It had not adequately accounted for the mosque. That was a significant oversight. In October of 1978, under pressure from the Shah's government, Iraq expelled Khomeini. He landed, after some deliberation, in a small village outside Paris called Neauphle-le-Château. The irony was almost luxurious. Exiled to the international media capital of the world, with unrestricted access to telephone lines and a constant stream of visiting journalists, Khomeini's reach expanded enormously. A crackdown meant to silence him had accidentally handed him a global broadcast platform. Don't worry. It gets better. Or worse, depending on where you were standing. By then, Iran was already burning. 1978 brought escalating waves of protest, each one larger than the last, cycling through a pattern of demonstration, crackdown, morning procession, and larger demonstration. In August, a cinema fire in the city of Abadan killed over 400 people. Revolutionary sentiment blamed Savak, a charge that remains contested, but in the political climate of 1978, the truth was almost beside the point. Then came September 8th, which Iranians would call Black Friday. In Tehran's Jaleh Square, soldiers opened fire on a large crowd of protesters. The exact death toll is still disputed, ranging from dozens to several hundred, but the name stuck. The revolution had its massacre. The Shah, meanwhile, was suffering from lymphoma, a diagnosis kept secret even from most of his own government. He was indecisive, visibly uncertain, alternating between concessions and crackdowns with a paralysis that satisfied nobody. By the autumn, oil workers had joined the strikes, which for a petrostate is roughly the equivalent of your heart going on strike. Production fell catastrophically. The CIA, for its part, had produced an assessment in August of 1978, just weeks before the revolution reached full boil, concluding that Iran was not in a revolutionary or even a pre-revolutionary situation. This is the kind of sentence that ages particularly badly. The agency had limited human intelligence inside the religious networks and had spent years viewing Iranian politics primarily through the lens of Soviet containment. It had looked at Iran and seen a stable ally. It had missed approximately everything else. The Shah left Iran on January 16, 1979, officially for a vacation. He would never return. And 2 weeks later, a man with a cassette tape empire boarded a plane from Paris toward Tehran. On November 4, 1979, several hundred Iranian students climbed the walls of the American embassy in Tehran just after 10 in the morning, and the world has not quite recovered from it since. The trigger was almost administrative. The Shah, now wandering in exile and deteriorating fast, had been admitted to a New York hospital in late October for treatment of lymphoma and a blocked bile duct. The Carter administration had resisted this for months, knowing exactly how it would look in Tehran. Then the old arguments won out. Humanitarian concern, diplomatic loyalty, pressure from Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller. So they'd let him in. And Iran, which had spent decades watching America prop up, protect, and ultimately evacuate the Shah, saw this not as a medical decision but as an insult. Possibly as a conspiracy. Probably both. The students who scaled that embassy wall called themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. They expected to hold the compound for a few days, make a statement, then leave. Instead, they stayed for 444 days. Because the Ayatollah endorsed them, the provisional government collapsed under the pressure, and a symbolic protest became the architecture of a new Iran. Inside the embassy, the scene was something particular. 66 Americans zip-tied or blindfolded moved through corridors they no longer controlled. Shredding machines running at full speed in the first chaotic minutes. Diplomats destroying whatever sensitive material they could before the doors gave way, though the students recovered enough of it to keep releasing damaging documents for months. Outside the walls, the chanting was constant, a kind of ambient hostility that the hostages later said they heard in their sleep for years afterward. The smell of burning documents. The cold of a Tehran November. The strange suspended time of captivity with no visible end. Carter tried negotiation. He tried freezing Iranian assets. He tried patience, which is a political strategy with a famously short shelf life. Then in April of 1980, he tried Operation Eagle Claw, a rescue mission involving 8 helicopters, multiple aircraft, a staging area in the Iranian desert called Desert One, and an enormous quantity of hope. 3 of the 8 helicopters malfunctioned before reaching the staging area. The mission was aborted. Then, on the ground, a helicopter and a transport aircraft collided in the dark and sand. 8 American servicemen died in the wreckage. The helicopters burned in the desert overnight, and by morning the images were everywhere. It was not just a failed rescue. It was a visual symbol of American impotence broadcast to the entire planet. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, who had opposed the mission, resigned. Carter's approval ratings entered territory usually associated with active disasters. The presidency was functionally over before the election even arrived. Ronald Reagan won in November of 1980 with a campaign built partly on that accumulated humiliation, the sense that America had spent 4 years being pushed around. He was inaugurated on January 20th, 1981. The hostages were released that same day, after 444 days, minutes after Reagan finished his oath of office. The timing was precise enough to be pointed. Whether the Reagan campaign had quietly negotiated to delay the release until after Carter's presidency ended has been investigated, debated, and never fully resolved. History has a way of leaving those particular doors slightly ajar. The hostages came home thin, blinking, wearing yellow ribbons that had been tied around trees across America since a Tony Orlando song made it a national symbol of waiting. They had missed 444 days of ordinary life. Several had gray hair they hadn't had before. What they left behind, politically, was more permanent than any of them could have known. Iran and America had broken something that had no obvious repair procedure, and both countries were now locked into roles, enemy and enemy, villain and villain, depending on which side of the story you're reading. The hostage crisis didn't create that enmity alone, but it gave it a face, a duration, and a wound that both nations have been pressing on ever since. And the man who had made all of it theologically possible was already sick, though very few people knew it yet. Saddam Hussein launched his invasion of Iran on September 22, 1980, and the timing was, from his perspective, almost elegant. Iran was isolated, sanctioned, and still digesting its own revolution. It seemed like a good week to grab some territory. It was not a good week. What followed was 8 years of industrialized slaughter that the 20th century had largely promised itself it was done with. Trench warfare. Poison gas drifting across marshlands. Children as young as 13 sent to clear minefields on foot, some of them carrying plastic keys that were reportedly distributed by the government as symbols of the paradise awaiting martyrs. The Iranian death toll reached somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million, depending on the source and the century. The numbers are too large to fully absorb, which is perhaps why the war received so little space in Western memory. Here is where America re-enters the story. The Reagan administration, watching Iran and concluding that a revolutionary Islamic republic controlling the Persian Gulf would be somewhat inconvenient, made a decision. Not a loud decision. A quiet one, conducted through back channels and diplomatic handshakes and intelligence briefings delivered to Baghdad by a special envoy named Donald Rumsfeld, who visited Saddam Hussein in December of 1983 to warm the relationship along. Satellite imagery. Battlefield intelligence. The knowledge of where Iranian troops were massed. This was shared while American officials knew, with documented certainty, that Iraq was deploying chemical weapons. The State Department cables are not ambiguous about this. They simply concluded that Iraq losing to Iran would be worse. Pragmatism, in other words, dressed in its least attractive outfit. Then came July 3rd, 1988. The USS Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser operating in the Strait of Hormuz, shot down Iran Air Flight 655. 290 civilians. A commercial flight on a scheduled route. The crew had misidentified it as a military aircraft despite it broadcasting the correct civilian transponder codes. The Reagan administration expressed regret, but the captain of the Vincennes later received a combat action ribbon. Iran received condolences. George H.W. Bush, then vice president, said simply, "I will never apologize for the United States of America." Ever. The quote was not forgotten in Tehran. The war ended that same summer with a ceasefire. Khomeini described accepting it as drinking poison. But the revolutionary government had what it needed most, which was proof. 8 years of American intelligence, American diplomatic cover, and 290 bodies floating in the Persian Gulf. The narrative of American hostility was no longer a grievance. It was a documented record. What happened next would be, in its own way, even quieter. Oliver North kept a shredder in his office, which is the kind of detail that tells you everything you need to know before you even begin. The year was 1986. The Reagan administration was publicly immovable on one point. America did not negotiate with terrorists. Certainly not the Iranian government, which Washington had spent years branding as the premier sponsor of international terror. This was the official position. It was stated clearly, repeated often, and printed in bold wherever necessary. It was also, quietly, a lie. Here is how the machinery worked. The United States, operating through Israel as a convenient middleman, began shipping weapons to Iran. Anti-tank missiles first, then anti-aircraft missiles, delivered in increments carefully sized to maintain deniability. The Iranians wanted the weapons for their grinding war with Iraq, the same war America was simultaneously helping Iraq fight. If that sounds like playing both sides of a table while insisting you're not at the table, you're beginning to understand American foreign policy in the 1980s. The payment for those weapons then traveled through a labyrinth of shell accounts and creative bookkeeping to fund the Nicaraguan Contra, a rebel group whose financing Congress had explicitly prohibited through the Boland Amendment. So, weapons to an enemy, money to a proxy army, all of it technically illegal, all of it generating paperwork that Oliver North fed, page by page, into that shredder. The whole arrangement unraveled in November of 1986, when a Lebanese newspaper published the story and the White House discovered you cannot actually shred a foreign press. Reagan went on television and told the American public that no such arms transfer had occurred. He corrected himself 2 weeks later, which is a polite way of saying he admitted it. His national security advisor and several aides resigned within days. North was fired. The Tower Commission, convened to investigate, produced a report in February of 1987 that described the operation with a kind of careful, devastating language that only official investigations can manage. The deep irony was not lost on anyone paying attention, least of all in Tehran. The country that American officials had publicly called a terrorist state, the country against which America had applied sanctions, had been receiving American missiles while those same officials held press conferences about the dangers of appeasing Iran. Realpolitik, the thinking goes, requires flexibility. What it actually requires, apparently, is a good shredder and a reliable contact in Tel Aviv. For Iranians, the revelation landed differently than it did for most Americans. Where Americans heard a scandal about congressional oversight and executive overreach, Iranians heard confirmation. The enemy had been secretly arming them while publicly condemning them because the enemy did whatever served the enemy's interests. The revolutionary government had been saying this since 1979. Iran-Contra handed them the receipts. The gap between American rhetoric and American behavior so carefully obscured for so long, had been put into the public record. And in the years that followed, both countries would have to decide what to do with that record. The answer, as it turned out, was mostly to set it aside and find new reasons to distrust each other. In the autumn of 2001, Iranian intelligence officers were sharing targeting information with American forces in Afghanistan. Sit with that for a moment. This was not a rumor. It was documented, confirmed by American officials who were grateful enough to accept the help and careful enough not to say so too loudly. Iran despised the Taliban with a particular intensity, having nearly gone to war with them in 1998 after Taliban fighters killed Iranian diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif. The enemy of Iran's enemy was, briefly, something resembling a partner. Iranian diplomats sat in the same rooms as American diplomats in Bonn in December of 2001, helping to shape the new Afghan government. They pressed for candidates. They offered leverage. They behaved, in other words, like a country that wanted something to work. The door was not open, but it was cracked. Then, on January 29, 2002, George W. Bush stood before a joint session of Congress and read the three words that closed it: Iraq, Iran, North Korea. The axis of evil. The phrase had been drafted by speechwriter David Frum, polished for rhetorical impact, and delivered with the full moral confidence of a man who had not recently been sharing intelligence with one of the named parties. Iranian reformists, led by President Mohammad Khatami, heard the speech in something close to disbelief. They had spent years arguing, at considerable political cost, that engagement with the West was possible. The Axis of Evil speech was not a rebuttal to that argument. It was a gift-wrapped humiliation delivered on live television. The hardliners in Tehran, who had always maintained that America could not be trusted, did not even need to say "told you so." The footage said it for them. Then came 2003 and the war in Iraq, and a moment that historians still find almost unbearably frustrating to contemplate. Through the Swiss ambassador in Tehran, Iran sent Washington a detailed diplomatic proposal. 2 pages. Comprehensive. It offered to discuss Iran's nuclear program, its support for militant groups, and normalized relations. The Bush administration did not respond. A State Department official reportedly reprimanded the Swiss diplomat for transmitting it. The administration's position, apparently, was that you do not negotiate with members of the Axis of Evil, even when they are politely requesting the chance to stop being one. The reformists lost the next elections. The hardliners consolidated power. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president in 2005. What happens next? The nuclear standoff, the sanctions, the acceleration of centrifuges begins to make a terrible kind of sense. By 2004, Iran had roughly 160 centrifuges spinning at Natanz, a facility buried under meters of reinforced concrete in the Isfahan desert. By 2010, that number had grown past 8,000. You do not need to be a nuclear physicist to understand what that trajectory means. The people who were nuclear physicists understood it very well, and they were extremely unhappy about it. The international response was loud, layered, and largely ineffective until it wasn't. The United Nations passed rounds of sanctions. The United States passed more. European banks began cutting ties with Iranian financial institutions. The Iranian rial, which had traded at roughly 10,000 to the dollar in 2010, collapsed to 30,000 by 2012. Ordinary Iranians watched their savings dissolve. Medicine became difficult to import. A diabetic in Tehran was not a geopolitical abstraction. She was just a person who could no longer reliably afford insulin. Quietly, something else was happening. In 2010, Iranian engineers began noticing that their centrifuges were failing at a peculiar rate. The machines would spin too fast, then too slow, then simply break, while the monitoring software calmly reported that everything was fine. It was not fine. A joint American and Israeli operation had deployed a piece of malware called Stuxnet, the first cyber weapon ever known to cause physical destruction in the real world. It was, in the most unsettling sense, elegant. No explosion, no fingerprints, no declaration of war. Just a quiet industrial sabotage conducted from a server somewhere, leaving Iranian technicians staring at perfectly normal readouts on their screens while their equipment quietly destroyed itself. Warfare had found a new register. The sanctions and the sabotage bought time. What they could not buy was a solution. That required diplomacy, the very thing that had been so thoroughly abandoned in 2003. The Obama administration, through secret back-channel talks in Oman beginning around 2012, eventually opened a negotiating track that culminated in July of 2015. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA, ran to 159 pages. Iran agreed to reduce its enriched uranium stockpile by 98%, cap centrifuge numbers, and accept rigorous international inspections. In exchange, sanctions were lifted. There was a brief, strange moment of cautious optimism in diplomatic circles, the kind that feels almost fragile, like it might shatter if you looked at it too directly. It would not survive the next administration. But that is a story for another chapter. On the 8th of May, 2018, Donald Trump stood in the White House diplomatic reception room and called the JCPOA a horrible one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. He signed a presidential memorandum withdrawing the United States from it. The 159 pages, the painstaking Oman back channels, the inspectors with their clipboards and their carefully negotiated access, all of it dissolved in roughly 11 minutes of remarks. The reimposition of maximum pressure sanctions was swift and deliberately suffocating. Iranian oil exports, which had partially recovered after the JCPOA, collapsed again. The currency cratered further. European partners, who had begged Washington not to withdraw, attempted briefly to construct workaround financial mechanisms to keep the deal alive. These efforts were, to use a technical diplomatic term, unsuccessful. Iran began rolling back its own commitments in stages, spinning up centrifuges again, crossing enrichment thresholds the deal had forbidden. The agreement was still technically alive, in the way a patient is technically alive when most of the monitors have been switched off. The reformists in Tehran, the faction that had staked enormous political credibility on the deal and on the premise that engagement with the West was possible, were left holding nothing. Hassan Rouhani, the president who had championed the JCPOA, could not explain to ordinary Iranians why they had accepted all those constraints and received, in the end, more sanctions. The hardliners who had warned from the beginning that America could not be trusted did not need to say anything. They simply waited. Then came January 3rd, 2020, and the night air at Baghdad International Airport. Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force and arguably the single most operationally powerful military figure in the Middle East, was killed by an American drone strike while leaving the airport in a convoy. He had commanded proxy forces across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen for decades. His death sent a genuine shockwave through Iranian society across factional lines. Even Iranians who despised the regime and everything Soleimani represented had complicated feelings about watching their country's most prominent general killed in a foreign country by a foreign missile. Iran's retaliation came within days. ballistic missile strikes on 2 Iraqi bases housing American troops. No Americans were killed, though over 100 later reported traumatic brain injuries. Iran had, with apparent deliberateness, telegraphed the strike just enough to allow evacuation. The message was calibrated. We responded. You survive, now stop. Both sides stepped back from the edge. But the edge had gotten considerably closer. The pattern, by this point, has a certain grim rhythm to it, doesn't it? A diplomatic opening appears. Someone walks through it carefully, painfully, with enormous political cost. Then, from one direction or the other, it gets kicked shut. The moderates lose credibility. The hardliners gain it. The next opening becomes harder to imagine, let alone achieve. Each generation inherits a relationship slightly more calcified than the last, slightly more defined by the worst moments rather than the best intentions. Which brings us to where we are now, and the question of whether the pattern can ever actually break. Somewhere in a Tehran archive, there is almost certainly a file on Mohammad Mossadegh. His face, his policies, his allies, his enemies, cataloged by a government that came to power partly because his government was destroyed. And somewhere in Langley, Virginia, there is a file on Operation Ajax, the 1953 coup that destroyed him. 2 filing cabinets. 70 years of consequences between them. This is what it looks like when geopolitical enemies are manufactured. Not with a declaration, not with a battle, but with a decision made in a room by confident men who believed they understood the situation completely. The British wanted their oil revenue back. The Americans wanted a buffer against Soviet influence. Mossadegh had to go. It took the CIA roughly $800,000 and a few weeks to end Iranian democracy and install a king. Bargain, really. Until you count the compound interest. Every sanctions headline you read today traces a direct line back to that August morning in 1953, when the coup succeeded and Mossadegh was placed under house arrest. Every failed negotiation carries the ghost of the trust that was broken then, and broken again in '63 when the Shah crushed religious reformers, and again in '79 when the hostages spent 444 days in captivity, and again in 2003 when Tehran's secret cooperation offer went unanswered, and again in 2018 when a working nuclear agreement got torn up in 11 minutes of televised remarks. The tragedy that rarely makes the news is the Iranian people themselves, caught in the space between 2 governments that have found them politically useful as symbols and institutionally inconvenient as humans. Ordinary Iranians who wanted none of this. Who wanted pharmacies stocked with medicine that sanctions make difficult to import? Who wanted their savings to hold value? Who filled the streets in 2019 and 2022, not for the Islamic Republic, not for Washington, but for themselves, and were met with bullets? They are not abstractions. They are the people who have been failed, systematically, by every powerful actor in this story. Here is the darkly cozy truth about how great enmities are built. They are not built by monsters. They are built by ordinary decision makers working within ordinary institutional incentives, making locally rational choices that compound catastrophically over time. Nobody in 1953 thought they were starting a 70-year conflict. They thought they were solving a problem by Thursday. That is the part that should keep you up at night, not the villains, the confidence. Because the pattern does not require malice to repeat. It only requires the comfortable certainty that this time we understand the situation completely, that this decision made in this room will resolve things neatly, that the people on the other side of the policy are variables to be managed rather than people navigating the same wreckage we helped create. The fingerprints are still on the file. The question, as it has been for 70 years, is whether anyone in the rooms where these decisions get made will bother to read what happened the last time someone was this sure.